The insistent chirping of my pager cut through the quiet hum of the city. It was 2 a.m., the kind of hour that usually meant a fender bender or a domestic dispute, not this. The tone was urgent, the dispatcher's voice clipped and professional, but underneath I could hear a tremor of something else. Unease. Cole, we've got one. And it's unusual. Unusual was an understatement. The call sent me straight to the medical examiner's office during a power outage. Not my favorite place on a good day, and certainly not when the emergency lights were casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. The air inside was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant, usually a comfort, now just another layer of the unsettling atmosphere. The backup generators had kicked in, but they were sputtering, their low rumble a constant reminder of the city's vulnerability. I pushed through the double doors, my flashlight beam cutting a path through the gloom. A uniformed officer, his face pale in the flickering light, was waiting for me. "Cole, thank God, this way." He led me down a corridor, the silence amplifying the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum. Each step felt heavier than the last. The scene was in the main examination room, a place I knew intimately, yet tonight it felt alien. The usual bright, clinical lights were replaced by the weak, flickering glow of battery-powered lanterns, casting the room in a theatrical, almost morbid light. And then I saw it, the body. A man sprawled on the cold metal examination table. It was the way he was positioned, every detail meticulously arranged. The stillness wasn't just the stillness of death, it was the stillness of deliberate placement. It was a tableau, a performance. My breath hitched. I'd seen this before, not this exact scene, not this specific victim, but the style. It was a ghost from my past, a case that had haunted my dreams for years, a case that remained unsolved, a gaping wound in my career. "Who found him?" I asked, my voice a low rumble trying to keep it steady. A night watchman, doing his rounds, said he'd never seen anything like it. The uniformed officer gestured vaguely with his flashlight. I approached the table, my flashlight beam sweeping over the victim. Middle-aged, unremarkable in life it seemed, but the staging, that was the signature. A single, wilting rose placed on his chest. His hands were clasped, not in prayer, but in a pose of almost theatrical repose. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, as if he'd been caught in a moment of profound realization. My mind raced, sifting through decades of casework, searching for a match, a flicker of recognition. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a message. And the sender was someone who knew my history, someone who was deliberately dredging up old ghosts. "Anything else?" I asked, my gaze still fixed on the scene. "Just this." The officer pointed to a small, leather-bound book lying beside the body, a diary perhaps, or a journal. I'd learned to be wary of anything that looked too convenient, too placed, but I had to examine it. I donned my gloves, the familiar latex snapping against my skin. I picked up the book, its weight surprisingly substantial. The leather was worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, my heart thudding a heavy, uneven rhythm against my ribs. The handwriting was elegant, almost calligraphic, and the first entry, it was dated nearly 30 years ago. The words swam before my eyes, but the sentiment was clear. A confession, a justification, a promise. This wasn't just a copycat. This was the original, or someone who knew the original intimately. Someone playing a very sick, very dangerous game. And I was the intended audience. The chosen pawn. The power outage felt less like an inconvenience and more like a deliberate choice, a way to obscure, to disorient. This killer wasn't just good, they were clever. They understood the theater of it all. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from a rising tide of frustration and a grim, familiar determination. This was personal now. This wasn't just another case file to be closed. This was a reckoning. And I wouldn't let it end the way the last one did. I would find this person. I would uncover their motive. And I would stop them. The game had begun and I was already on the board. The flickering emergency lights of the medical examiner's office during a power outage cast long, dancing shadows across the room. They pulsed weakly, a dying heartbeat in the oppressive silence. My colleague, the lead detective, gestured with a gloved hand towards the center of the examination table. "This is what we've got, Cole." I stepped closer, the scent of antiseptic struggling against something else, something metallic and cloying. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, tracing the outline of the victim. A man, middle-aged. No obvious signs of struggle, at least not at first glance, but the staging. It was the staging that made my gut clench. The way the victim was positioned, the specific items placed around him, it was too precise, too familiar. "Anything obvious?" the detective asked, his voice low. I knelt beside the table, my gaze sweeping over the scene. His eyes were closed as if he'd simply fallen asleep, but the stillness was profound, unnatural. On a small stainless steel tray beside his head lay a single, tarnished silver locket. I'd seen that locket before, not in person but in photographs, decades-old photographs. "This locket," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "It's identical to one found at the Miller scene." The detective frowned, his brow furrowed in the dim light. "Miller, the old one." My own heart had picked up a rhythm that had nothing to do with the flickering lights. The Miller case. It was the one that had haunted my early career, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. And now here it was, staring me in the face, resurrected. I pulled out my kit, the familiar weight a small comfort. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage felt thick, charged with an unseen energy. Every movement I made was deliberate, calculated. I began with the victim, gently lifting his hands, examining his fingernails. Nothing. No defensive wounds, no foreign DNA. It was almost too clean, too perfect. "Forensics are on their way with generators," the detective said, his voice a low murmur, "but they are saying it could be an hour, maybe more." An hour. I pulled out my evidence bags, carefully documenting each item. The locket went in first. Then, a small, intricately carved wooden bird placed on the victim's chest, another echo. The Miller killer had a penchant for symbolic objects. "This is no random act," I said, my gaze fixed on the wooden bird. "This is a message. Someone is recreating the Miller murders." The detective swore softly. "But Miller was 20 years ago. The killer was never caught. We thought it was a one-off, a spree that just stopped." "It didn't stop," I countered, my mind racing. "It just went dormant." The walls were a pale, institutional green, usually sterile and unforgiving. Now they seemed to absorb the light, holding onto the secrets of the room. I noticed a faint scuff mark on the floor near the far wall, almost invisible in the gloom. It wasn't blood, not a spill. It looked like something had been dragged. "What is it?" the detective asked, following my gaze. "Nothing," I said, though my mind was already cataloging possibilities. Was it part of the staging? A deliberate clue or a mistake? The killer was meticulous, I had to give them that, but no one was perfect. I continued my examination, my senses heightened. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of the building's emergency backup systems, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I ran my gloved fingers along the edge of the examination table, searching for anything out of place. A faint residue, almost like fine dust, clung to the metal. I collected a sample. It didn't smell like anything I could immediately identify. "Anything else?" the detective pressed. I shook my head, my focus unwavering. "Not yet, but this isn't just a copycat, detective. This is personal. The staging, the symbols, they're too specific." I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched. I had to admit, a part of me, a small, unwelcome part, felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the kind of case that defined a career or broke it. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my gut that this was going to be a long, grueling investigation. I had to be better this time. I had to be. The smell hit me first, even before I saw the flickering emergency lights. A cloying, sweet odor, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. It was the signature scent of decomposition, a smell I'd tried to outrun for years, but it always found me. Tonight, it was amplified, thick and suffocating within the confines of the medical examiner's office during a power outage. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. The usual sterile hum of equipment was replaced by an unnerving silence, punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren and the drip, drip, drip of something I didn't want to identify. A colleague, a fresh-faced woman I'd only met a few weeks ago, was fumbling with a battery-powered lantern near the main examination table. His hands trembled slightly. "Cole," he whispered, his voice tight. "This is something else. The original me, Dr. Albright, he's the victim." I swallowed, the bile rising in my throat. Dr. Albright. The man who'd been the medical examiner on the original Devereaux case, the one that had haunted my nightmares for 20 years. I moved closer, my own flashlight beam sweeping over the scene. The staging was meticulous. Albright lay on the table, his eyes wide and unseeing, a grimace frozen on his face. But it wasn't the gore that seized my attention. It was the details. A tarnished silver locket placed carefully on his chest, its lid ajar to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman. A single, perfect white rose resting beside his head. My mind flashed back to the Devereaux file, to the crime scene photos I'd pored over countless times, the same locket, the same rose. The killer hadn't just echoed the past, they'd recreated it down to the smallest, most disturbing detail. "He was found like this?" I asked the colleague, my voice rougher than I intended. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the body. "The night watchman found him, said the power went out about an hour ago. He heard a thud, came to check and found this." I circled the table, my eyes scanning every inch of the room. The air grew heavier, pressing in on me. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message, a taunt, and the sender knew exactly how to get under my skin. "The original Devereaux case," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "They staged it exactly like this. The locket, the rose, everything." Her eyes widened. "You worked that case." "I was a rookie," I replied, the memory a bitter taste. "But it stuck with me, this killer. They're playing a game." I needed to see the old files. The real files, not the digitized versions that lacked the tactile feel of a life lived and lost. I needed to feel the weight of the paper, smell the faded ink, see the smudges left by hands long gone. "I need to get to the archives," I told the colleague. "Can you secure this scene? Nobody touches anything until the techs get here." He nodded, his professional demeanor kicking in despite the unsettling circumstances. "Of course, Cole. I'll make sure of it." The archives were in the basement of the precinct, a labyrinth of metal shelves crammed with the city's forgotten stories. The power outage hadn't reached this deep, thankfully. I found the Devereaux box, its cardboard worn thin with age and handling. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, the case photos stared up at me. The victim, a young woman named Sarah Devereaux, her life brutally cut short. The crime scene, eerily similar to the one I'd just left. And there, tucked away in a plastic evidence bag, was the original locket. I held it in my gloved hand, the metal cool and smooth. It felt heavy, laden with the weight of unanswered questions. I spread out the original autopsy report. Albright's neat, precise handwriting filled the pages. He'd noted the locket, the rose, the meticulous staging. He'd even speculated about the killer's psychological state, his need for attention, his desire to recreate a tableau. But he'd never identified the killer. Then I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible detail, tucked away in the supplementary notes. A witness statement, taken weeks after the initial investigation, from a neighbor who'd reported seeing a strange man lurking around Devereaux's apartment building in the days leading up to her murder. The witness hadn't thought much of it at the time, dismissing him as a deliveryman or a canvasser. The original investigator had apparently logged it as insignificant. But now, a strange man lurking. The same kind of man, I imagined, who would meticulously stage a crime scene to mimic a past tragedy. I remembered another detail from the original case, something I dismissed as irrelevant at the time. A small, antique music box found in Sarah Devereaux's apartment, not directly related to the murder but seemingly out of place. It had been logged as a personal item, but no one had ever traced its origin. Could it have been a gift? From whom? My mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory and newly unearthed information. The locket, the rose, the music box, the lurking stranger. They were threads, disparate and fragile, but they were all I had. I needed to talk to someone who knew Albright, someone who might have insights into his final days, his recent concerns. I thought of a retired detective, a grizzled old-timer named Miller who had been Albright's friend. Miller had retired years ago, but he still kept tabs on the old cases. The power was still out when I arrived at Miller's quiet suburban home. He opened the door, his eyes, still sharp despite his age, taking me in. He looked surprised to see me. Cole and the scene. It's a recreation. Miller's face went pale. He stepped aside, ushering me into a living room filled with the scent of pipe tobacco and old books. As I recounted the details, the staging, the locket, the rose, Miller listened intently, his brow furrowed. Albright was a good man, Miller answered, his voice thick with emotion. He hated that Devereaux case. It ate at him. He always felt he missed something. Did he ever mention any unusual cases recently, anything that troubled him? I pressed. Miller thought for a moment, tapping his pipe against his palm. He did mention something a few weeks back, said he thought he was onto something, a pattern, but he was always like that, chasing ghosts. A pattern, the lurking stranger, the music box. It was all starting to connect, to form a disturbing picture. The killer wasn't just reliving the past, they were correcting it. Miller shook his head. No names, just that he felt he was close to solving something big. Albright had been killed because he was getting too close. And now, the killer knew I was looking. The game had just escalated, and I was the next move on their twisted board. I had to dive deeper into the past, not just to catch a killer, but to finally lay my own demons to rest. The hum of the generator was a pathetic whisper against the ink-eye blackness. I stood in the doorway of the medical examiner's office during a power outage, the air thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something I couldn't quite place, like old, dry dust mixed with regret. Albright's body lay under a sheet on the examination table, his face pale and still in the flickering beam of my flashlight. This wasn't how it was supposed to end for him. He was a good man, meticulous, and he'd been right on the edge of something big. Now he was just evidence. My flashlight beam swept across the room, catching the glint of stainless steel instruments, the sterile white of the walls. The usual clinical order was disrupted by the emergency lighting, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar space feel alien. A colleague, his face grim in the dim light, was bagging Albright's hands. He didn't meet my eyes. Nobody did, not really, not since the Albright call. "Anything, Cole?" the colleague asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my throat tight. Just gone. Whatever he was working on, it's gone. I'd checked Albright's personal effects, his desk at the precinct, even his apartment. Nothing. It was as if the killer had surgically removed any trace of his investigation. My mind kept replaying the initial scene at Albright's place. The meticulous staging, the deliberate echo of the old case. It wasn't just a copycat. This was a message, a taunt. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about stopping a pattern that had been dormant for 20 years, now awakened with a terrifying ferocity. A sharp rap on the door jolted me. Another colleague stood there, his face a mask of shock. "Cole," he began, his voice strained, "I need to see this." My gut clenched. My flashlight beam followed his gaze, landing on a figure slumped against the far wall. It was the stranger, the one I'd seen lurking near Albright's apartment, the one who'd vanished into the night. But this time he wasn't vanishing. He was posed, arranged, just like the first victim. My breath hitched. This was too much, too deliberate. The stranger wore the same cheap suit, the same vacant stare, but there was something different, the same locket that had been found clutched in the hand of the first victim decades ago. He, sitting there like he was waiting. I moved closer, my flashlight beam steady, forcing myself to ignore the rising tide of nausea. The stranger's skin had a waxy pallor, and a faint, sweetish scent hung in the air around him, something akin to overripe fruit. It was the same scent I'd noticed faintly at the first scene. It was the killer's signature. I knelt, my gloved fingers gently touching the locket. Inside, I knew there would be nothing, just like the original. The killer wasn't leaving clues, they were leaving breadcrumbs, leading me down a path of their own design. "The knot," I murmured, my voice rough. "It's the same, the original case." They identified it as a sailor's knot, a specific type. The colleague nodded, his eyes wide. "I saw the old reports. They never identified the knot's significance, just a detail. A detail that was now being repeated. This wasn't just a copycat, this was a resurrection. And Albright, by getting too close, had become the first casualty of its revival. Now this stranger, who was he and why him? Was he connected to the original case? Or was he just another pawn in this elaborate, deadly game? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but they seemed to scatter like startled birds. The old case files were a labyrinth of dead ends, decades of unanswered questions, of frustrated investigators. And now I was wading through that same mire with a killer who was clearly enjoying every minute of it. I stood, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The medical examiner's office during a power outage with 2 bodies and a ghost from the past. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a personal challenge, a race against time. The killer wanted me to see this. They wanted me to understand the stakes, and I was starting to get a grim, unwelcome sense of their purpose. It wasn't just about murder. It was about reclaiming something, or perhaps about making me pay for something I didn't even remember doing. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage hung thick and still, smelling of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet. My flashlight beam cut through the oppressive darkness, dancing over the sterile surfaces, the stainless steel instruments laid out with unnerving precision and the sheet-draped form on the slab. Albright, still here. Still a ghost in this place, even in death. The silence was a heavy blanket, broken only by the distant hum of a generator kicking in somewhere, a weak pulse in the city's blackout. My own breathing felt too loud, too ragged. The flickering emergency lights, when they finally sputtered to life, cast long, distorted shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Albright's face, pale and serene under the harsh glare, was a stark reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a reckoning. I'd spent the last 24 hours poring over every scrap of evidence, every photograph, every witness statement from the old case. Decades ago, the sculptor case. A brutal series of killings meticulously staged, then abruptly stopped, unsolved, until now. The parallels were too stark to ignore. And now Albright, found in a warehouse district miles from anywhere, his body posed with the same unsettling symmetry as the sculptor's victims. "Anything new, Cole?" The voice of a colleague, a junior investigator named Miller, startled me. He stood at the doorway, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. "Just the same old song and dance, Miller. Different venue, same tune." I gestured with my flashlight towards the slab. Albright, he was too close. He'd figured something out, I think. Miller stepped closer, his face etched with concern. "The old case files. You think this is him, the sculptor?" "I don't think, Miller. I know. The details are too precise. The choice of location, the way Albright was positioned. It's a carbon copy just a few decades later, and Albright wasn't the intended target, not originally. He just got in the way, like those others all those years ago." My voice was grim. I remembered the old case vividly. The frustration, the dead ends, the gnawing sense of failure that had haunted me for years. And now it was back. I ran my hand over my face, the stubble rough against my palm. The power outage was a disruption, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme, but it felt symbolic. "The killer," I began, my thoughts coalescing, the disparate pieces starting to form a picture. "He's not just recreating the past, he's revisiting it. This isn't about random violence. It's about a narrative, a story he's been telling himself, and now he's bringing it to life." I walked over to a portable examination table where a few of Albright's personal effects lay bagged. A wallet, a set of keys, a worn leather-bound notebook. I picked up the notebook, my gloved fingers tracing the embossed initials, J.A. Albright's. I flipped through the pages. Mostly mundane entries, appointments, shopping lists. Then towards the back, a series of dates circled. Dates that corresponded with the original sculptor killings. And next to each date, a single word scrawled in Albright's hand. Witness. Witness. Miller breathed, leaning in. He was watching them. Or he thought he was, or he was trying to connect them. Albright was a historian, wasn't he? Obsessed with local mysteries. This must have been his white whale. I felt a prickle of unease. Albright had been digging too deep. So the killer knows Albright was looking into it. More than a message, it's a taunt, a declaration. He's back and he's still in control, the staging. It's not just about leaving a signature. It's about demonstrating his superiority, his meticulous planning. He's a showman, a perverse artist. I tapped the notebook, and he's reacting to us, to the renewed attention. He's not just repeating the past, he's engaging with it, with us. The profile was starting to form in my mind, sharp and unsettling. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was calculated, premeditated, and deeply personal. The killer was intelligent, patient, and driven by a powerful, twisted sense of purpose. He relished the game, the fear, the control. He was methodical, detail-oriented, and likely saw himself as a victim of some past injustice, or perhaps a judge dispensing his own twisted brand of justice. He's been waiting, I murmured, more to myself than to Miller. For the right time, for the right circumstances. Maybe he felt forgotten, or maybe he just needed to finish what he started. And Albright, he gave him the perfect opportunity to announce his return. The emergency lights flickered again, casting a momentary strobe effect across Albright's face. He looked almost peaceful, a disturbing contrast to the chaos he'd inadvertently unleashed. The old case, I continued, my voice hardening with resolve. We need to go back to the beginning, not just the victims, but the locations, the context. The sculptor chose those places for a reason, and the killer is choosing them again. He's leading us somewhere. But within these sterile walls, illuminated by the weak emergency lights, a new kind of light was beginning to dawn. A grim, dangerous light, but a light nonetheless. The sculptor was back, and I was going to finish this one way or another. This time, failure wasn't an option. The emergency lights in the medical examiner's office during a power outage cast long, distorted shadows that danced with every flicker. The air, usually thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant, now held a faint metallic tang, a ghost of what had happened here. My gut churned. The sculptor, it had to be. The meticulous staging, the chilling artistry, it all pointed to him. And the victim was a message. A cruel, twisted echo of the very first case that had haunted my career. The victim, a young architect, lay under a stark white sheet. The sculptor had a penchant for presenting his work like exhibits. This wasn't just murder, it was a performance, and I was the unwilling audience. Anything Cole. The chief medical examiner's voice, usually steady, was laced with a tremor I hadn't heard before. He stood by the door, silhouetted against the dim hallway light, his face etched with a fatigue that went beyond the late hour. I shook my head, my gaze still fixed on the sheet-draped form. Not yet, but he's talking to me. He always is. My voice was low, almost a growl. The sculptor wasn't just a killer, he was a puppeteer, and I was one of his strings. He wanted me to know he was back, the way he arranged the scene. The chief gestured vaguely, his hand trembling. It's like he's mocking us, mocking you. I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. He is mocking me, and he's doing it because he knows I'm the only one who can connect the dots, the only one who remembers. The first case. The one that broke me, the one that got away. The sculptor's signature had been there, subtle then, blatant now. He'd honed his craft and the world was his canvas. I walked over to the evidence table where a small, intricately carved wooden bird lay beside the victim's belongings. It was a perfect replica, down to the delicate feather details, of one found at the scene of the very first sculptor murder. This was the taunt, the breadcrumb. He was laying out the timeline, daring me to keep up. He's not just killing, I murmured, picking up the bird with tweezers. He's rewriting history, or at least his version of it. I turned it over, examining the underside. No fingerprints, of course. The sculptor was a phantom, but there was something. A faint scuff mark, almost imperceptible. A tiny imperfection in his otherwise flawless work, a clue, or just another piece of misdirection. "What are you thinking, Cole?" the chief asked, stepping closer. I held the wooden bird up to the dim light. "He wants me to chase him. He wants the chase. He wants to feel the pressure, the fear." He was right. I had failed him before, and now he was back, making sure I knew it. "We can't just wait for him to strike again," the chief said, his voice firming. "We need to anticipate him." "Anticipate?" I scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "He's always one step ahead. He is the anticipation." But then a flicker of an idea ignited. A dangerous, desperate idea. What if we don't wait for him to come to us? What if we lure him out? The chief looked at me, his eyes wide. "How?" I set the wooden bird down carefully. "He's been leaving me messages, little gifts. This one," I tapped the bird, "is a direct challenge. He's telling me he's proud of his work. He wants me to admire it, to acknowledge it. He craves the recognition, even if it's from me. So I want to play along. No, I want to provoke him. He's an artist, right? And artists have egos. They want their work seen, appreciated, critiqued. He's been feeding me pieces of his masterpiece. It's time I showed him that I'm not just looking, I'm analyzing, I'm finding the flaws." I walked over to the victim's personal effects, picking up a framed photograph with my gloved hand. A smiling young woman, the architect. He chose her. Why her? What does she represent to him? He was working on the new City Plaza project, the chief offered. A very public, very high-profile commission. Public, I repeated, a slow smile spreading across my face. He likes public spaces, he likes the drama, he likes the audience. I looked at the photograph again, then back at the wooden bird. He's building something, a narrative, and he needs an audience to appreciate it. He needs me to be his critic. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The first crime scene, the victim's profession, the meticulous staging, the signature. It was all a performance, and the stage was about to be set for a final act. "We need to make him think I'm closing in," I responded, my voice gaining a hard edge. But not in a way that makes him run, in a way that makes him angry, in a way that makes him want to finish his masterpiece, to prove me wrong. "And how do we do that?" the chief asked, his voice a mixture of hope and apprehension. "We feed him information," I added, my eyes gleaming with a dangerous resolve. "We leak just enough to make him think I'm onto something specific, something he'll feel compelled to address, something that will force his hand. He's not going to stop until he's completed his grand design, and I'm going to make sure that design leads him right into a trap." The sculptor wanted a game, he was about to get one. And this time, I wouldn't be playing by his rules, I'd be setting them. The chief nodded, a grim set to his jaw. "Feed him information, I like it, risky, but I like it." He ran a hand over his tired face. "Just make sure I'm not walking into a trap, Cole." "When am I not?" I muttered, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. The plan was simple, audacious, and probably insane. We'd leak a carefully constructed narrative to a select few, enough to reach our phantom. The story would center around a supposed breakthrough in the Silver Creek case, a case that had haunted me for 20 years. We'd hint at a specific piece of evidence, something only the killer would know was fabricated, but that would make them believe I was closing in. It was a gamble, a bait on a very sharp hook. The next few days were a blur of hushed conversations and carefully worded emails. I felt like a puppeteer pulling strings in the dark, hoping the puppet would dance. Every notification on my phone, every unexpected call sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Was it him? Was he reacting? Then it happened. A cryptic message appeared on a burner phone I'd set up, delivered anonymously to a public drop point. It was short, chillingly simple. I read, "Looking in the wrong place. The truth isn't in the past, it's right here." My gut clenched. This was it. He was luring me. The chief wanted to send a tactical team, but I knew I had to go alone. This was personal. This was my unfinished business. The location was an old, disused industrial complex on the outskirts of town, a maze of decaying concrete and rusting metal. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Every creak of metal, every scuttling sound had me on edge. I was playing his game, and I knew I was walking into a trap, but the need to finally put this to rest was a physical ache. I found the main staging area in what looked like an old warehouse floor. The meticulous arrangement of objects, the specific colors, the way the light fell, it was a twisted homage. In the center of it all, illuminated by a single flickering emergency light, was a makeshift table, and on the table a body. My breath hitched. This wasn't a staged scene for me to analyze. This was real. The chief's voice buzzed in my ear, a frantic question about my location, but I couldn't respond. My focus was on the figure laid out before me, the details. They were too precise, too intimate, not a stranger, it couldn't be. I always were too focused on the past. The figure continued, stepping forward. The emergency light caught their face and my world tilted. It was the retired medical examiner, the one who had signed off on the original Silver Creek case, the one I had trusted implicitly. How? I stammered, my voice hoarse. He gave a sad smile. I was so eager to find a monster out there, I never looked at the one standing right beside I. He gestured to the body on the table. "This is my son, Cole," he was. Unwell, he admired my work, I see. He saw I as a hero, and when he started to exhibit the same tendencies as the original killer, he wanted to impress I. He thought if he could recreate the scenes, I'd understand him. I'd see him. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. The medical examiner's quiet demeanor, his access to information, his subtle misdirection during the initial investigation. It all clicked into place. He hadn't been covering for the killer, he had been enabling his own son. And when his son's obsession had turned deadly, he'd continued the charade, hoping to steer me away from the truth, even as his son escalated. "He confessed to me," the medical examiner said, his voice cracking. "He told me everything, and I couldn't let him go to prison, not my boy, so I helped him. I staged the scenes, I planted clues, I made sure I was looking in the right direction, but the wrong direction." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I thought if I could just control it, I could protect him, protect everyone, but it got out of hand. This last one, he went too far, he couldn't be stopped." My mind reeled. The original Silver Creek killer had never been caught. And now, here I was, facing the man who had orchestrated the entire charade, his son the perpetrator and the son now dead. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, the medical examiner was gone. But on the table next to his son's body lay a familiar, tarnished silver locket. The one I'd found at the original Silver Creek scene. The one that had always been dismissed as a dead end. It wasn't a dead end. It was a clue to a father's desperate, twisted love and a son's tragic descent. The mystery of Silver Creek wasn't solved, not entirely, but I knew who the killer was, and I knew why. The game was over, but the scars would remain. The sudden jolt of the lights snapping back on in the medical examiner's office during a power outage made me flinch. My hand instinctively went to the sidearm holstered at my hip, a habit ingrained over years of facing down the worst of humanity. But the only threat now was the lingering scent of disinfectant and the unsettling quiet that had descended after the chaos. The perpetrator, the younger man, lay still on the stainless steel table, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had filled the room mere moments before. My gaze drifted to the original evidence laid out beside him, the faded photographs, the brittle newspaper clippings, the meticulous notes I'd painstakingly compiled decades ago. They were ghosts, brought to life by a sick imitation, a twisted echo of a case that had haunted my dreams, a phantom limb of my career that had never quite healed. And now, the man who had orchestrated this elaborate, macabre play was gone, leaving his son, the unwilling pawn, dead at the scene. I walked over to the window, the grimy glass offering a distorted view of the city lights twinkling below. Each one felt like a tiny, accusing eye. I'd chased shadows for so long, clinging to the hope of closure, of redemption. This case, the original Silver Creek murders, had been my Everest, my white whale, and I'd failed. Utterly and completely. The killer had vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, and a void that had festered in my gut for 20 years. Then this copycat, this mimic, had emerged. He hadn't been interested in the murders themselves, not really. It was the staging, the meticulous recreation of the original scenes, the almost theatrical presentation. He wanted me to see it, to know it was him. And in doing so, he'd inadvertently led me to the truth. His father, the one who had planted the seeds of obsession in his son, feeding him stories, molding him into a vessel for his own unfinished business. A colleague, his face pale in the flickering emergency lights, approached cautiously. "Cole, okay." I turned, forcing a nod, just processing. My voice sounded rough, unfamiliar even to myself. He was so desperate for recognition, wasn't he? His father's legacy. The father, he's the one who confessed to the original crimes. The colleague asked, her eyes wide. Not confessed exactly, I corrected, a grim smile touching my lips. He confessed to making his son confess, to manipulating him, but he underestimated his son's theatricality, or perhaps his own son's desire to outdo him. The whole thing was a twisted feedback loop of ego and delusion. The father, unable to commit the crimes himself, had groomed his son to be his proxy, his legacy. And the son, in turn, had used the original crimes as a canvas for his own twisted art. I looked back at the younger man on the table. He hadn't killed anyone, not directly. He'd staged the scene, yes, but the original victims were long gone. His crimes were about manipulation, about rewriting history, about a desperate plea for his father's twisted approval. And in the end, he'd become a casualty of it. So the original killer, it was the father all along. The colleague pressed. He claimed he was the original killer. I replied, the words tasting like ash. But his son, he was the one who recreated the scenes. The son was the artist, the father the director. And now the director is gone and the lead actor, well, he's taken his final bow. It was a mess, a convoluted, tragic mess. My past failures had given this man the perfect hunting ground. He'd studied my every move, my every deduction, and used it to craft his elaborate game. I walked back to the table, my fingers tracing the outline of a faded scar on the younger man's forearm. It was identical to a mark on one of the original victims. A detail that had always bothered me, a loose thread I couldn't quite pull. The father had etched it himself, a twisted signature. He'd wanted his son to bear the mark of the killer, to be a living testament to his own depravity. "It's over," I answered, more to myself than to the colleague. The tension that had coiled in my gut for weeks began to loosen, replaced by a profound weariness. The chase was over. The ghost of Silver Creek had finally been laid to rest, not by my brilliant deduction but by the killer's own undoing. I knew there would be paperwork, interviews, debriefings, the usual post-mortem of a case. But tonight, all I felt was the weight of years lifting. The phantom limb of my career finally stopped throbbing. The failure still stung, the knowledge that I'd been outmaneuvered for so long, but it was tempered by a quiet sense of closure. I had faced my past, not in a triumphant victory, but in a somber confrontation, and I had survived. As I walked out of the medical examiner's office during a power outage, the city lights seemed a little less accusatory. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic. It was a symphony of normalcy, a stark contrast to the discordant notes that had played out within those sterile walls. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally start to build it, brick by painstaking brick, on solid ground.